Yeah.
All right, good morning, everyone. I think we're going to get started. Hopefully there are some more people coming up. We had about 90 people signed up for this session, but I think the vertical transportation can be challenging from time to time for folks. So I think people will be straggling in, but let's get started because we have a lot of great information to share with you this morning. My name is Susan Longworth. I'm with the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. This is the Local Governments Doing More with Less panel. So I hope you're in the right place. This is also, even if you're not, I hope you'll stick around because I think this is a fascinating topic, and we have some really wonderful perspectives to share this morning. You have the bios of our speakers in your binders, and so I encourage you to read those and learn more about them. We are, in the order of folks who will be presenting, it helps to set up the topic. We're going to start to my far right with Keith Wardrip from the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, who is going to be presenting some research that he's recently completed. And I think it's available downstairs, right, on the publication table, so I encourage you to pick those up. I meant to grab one to show, but I forgot. And so he's going to be presenting his research on 10 northeastern industrial cities, and helping us understand their financial positions, how they got to where they are today, and some of the challenges that they might face going forward. So much to his chagrin, Keith finds himself presenting the quote-unquote less part of this discussion. And so once we have that baseline understanding, then we'll move into our next two panelists. Next will be Andy Kopplin, who's sitting in the middle. He's the deputy mayor of the city of New Orleans. And we'll present the interesting case study of that city. It's hard to believe, but next year we're coming up on 10 years since Katrina, and I think for many of us, we still have that CNN loop playing in our head of those images following that historic storm. And I think it would be very useful for us to do a reset on some of those and to see how far the city's come, where it's going, and understand some of its current experiences and how it manages those. And then we're going to pull the lens out, and we're going to hear finally from David Eichenthal, who is with Public Financial Management. David has the benefit of seeing many different cities and working across the country, helping municipalities with their financial issues. David is also going to help bring in the aspect of the city-state relationship and help us understand how some of those, how that plays out. He's also going to introduce us to the National Resource Network, for which he is the executive director, and to help us understand what that contributes to the discussion and those resources that exist there. So we're going to cover a lot of ground. Briefly, I would hope that you would listen for issues surrounding shrinkage, and the issue, again, of growing cities versus shrinking cities obviously plays in directly with the theme of the conference. We're also going to talk a lot about crises, natural and man-made, and what those mean for a city, and how those can sometimes be opportunities. We're going to talk, obviously, about the relationship with the states and how those relationships can move from perhaps being dysfunctional to being productive. And then we're going to address the large issue in the room, which is of investments versus entitlements, and how cities can plan strategically for their future while still honoring their commitments. So on that note, our panelists are each going to speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and they each have a presentation for you. After that, I have a couple prepared questions, but then I hope to leave a lot of opportunity for discussion. I think there's probably some opportunity to share your own experiences, and so we'll look forward to hearing all of that. So, Keith.
Thank you, Susan. Good morning, everyone. As Susan said, my name is Keith Wardrip, and I'm representing the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia today. Before I get started, I should mention that the views that I'm about to express are mine and mine alone, and do not necessarily represent those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System. I don't think I'll say anything too outlandish, but just in case. As Susan alluded, the message that I'm about to deliver is not necessarily uplifting, so I'll apologize in advance. But I think it's an important message. I'm going to talk about the fiscal stress facing a lot of the post-industrial cities in our region. And even though it's not an uplifting message, I think it's important background, and it will provide, I think, for a fuller appreciation of the solutions and strategies that Andy and David are going to present. So this morning, I'm going to just begin with a little bit of context from my remarks, differentiate between structural and fiscal and cyclical fiscal stress, and then spend the bulk of my presentation on the sort of the present-day consequences, focusing on 6 financial fiscal indicators, investigate the implications for community development, and then wrap up. So as Susan mentioned, I recently completed some research and published a report called Fiscal Stress in the Small Post-Industrial City, Causes, Consequences, and Implications for Community Development. It is on the resource table downstairs. I meant to bring some up, but I forgot, to be honest. I hope you do pick one up, though. As background, this paper focuses on 10 cities in our region that had a peak population of between 50 and 150,000 and a historical reliance on manufacturing, generally exceeding 25% of their employment in manufacturing in 1950. You can see them on the screen. Our district covers eastern and central Pennsylvania, southern New Jersey, and Delaware. In truth, I was conducting research on a completely separate topic that had nothing to do with fiscal issues, and we were holding interviews with stakeholders in 9 of these cities. And the question we were asking was, what is your primary barrier to successful revitalization? And more often than not, the first answer was our fiscal challenges. So because we want to make sure that our research is responsive to the needs in our district, in October I began researching the report that we just published. I think it's worth spending a couple of seconds on differentiating between structural and cyclical fiscal challenges. Most cities and states experienced cyclical challenges during and immediately after the Great Recession. Most of their sources of revenue were compromised, whether they were property, sales, income taxes, development fees. And the recession and economic downturns generally can exacerbate pre-existing problems in these post-industrial cities. What's at the root of the fiscal issues in these cities is decades of population and job loss, and the impacts that it has had on their economic strength in eroding their tax base. So one point that I'd like to make up front is that these cities are generally less able to be fiscally self-reliant than they were historically. And I'm just going to illustrate that with a couple of slides. The chart on the left shows population change in these 10 cities, and each bar represents one of the 10. You can see that over the last 60 years, there was very slight population growth in the bars representing Allentown and Bethlehem, but pretty significant population decline in the other 8 cities. 5 of the cities lost more than a third of their population. And the cities aren't just smaller, but they're also poorer. The chart on the right shows the ratio of city median household income to state median household income in 1949 and in present day. And the gray bars representing 1949, you can see they're all right around 1, which means that the city and the state had about the same income profile in 1949. Today, though, you see the green bars are closer to about 2/3, closer to that 0.6, 0.7 level. So these cities are much poorer than they were relative to their states. With this degree of population loss, it's no surprise that vacancy rates have skyrocketed, property values are diminished, which sort of produces this chart, total market value per capita. So if you think of all the property within a city's limits, take the value of each property, total it, divided by the population. These are the numbers you would get. And for the average city with a population of over 40,000, the median is $83,000. We only had good data for 4 of the 10 cities in the report, but you can see it doesn't exceed 55,000. This has significant ramifications for generating property tax revenue, right? So when you have a lower market values, you can generate less revenue at a given tax rate, or you have to raise your taxes to generate a given level of revenues, which is not necessarily good for a city's competitiveness. I should also mention that one issue that we heard a lot about in our interviews is that anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 of the property value in these cities in some cases is tax exempt. So even though it would factor into these market values, they're not generating taxes. So I'm going to turn now to the present-day consequences of these trends. In the next 6 slides, I'm going to ask 6 questions. the answers shed light on the fiscal health of the cities. And then with the chart on each of these slides, I'm going to sort of answer those questions. So for example, actually before I start, I want to mention that all the data I'm presenting here are publicly available. You could find all this information in the city's annual financial reports. But luckily, I didn't have to do that. There's a research service called Merit Research Services, and they aggregate all this information, standardize it, and make it available through a software called Credit Scope. You can talk to me about that or read more about it in my report, but I wanted to make sure you knew where the data were coming from. So the first question is, does the city receive enough revenue from taxes, fees, grants, and assistance to cover its annual expenses? The chart shows the answer to that question. It shows the per capita difference in revenues and expenses for governmental activities. So I want to mention excluded from these revenues are sort of one-time revenues that cities can't expect on a year-to-year basis. So capital grants and contributions, transfers, asset sales, those sorts of things are excluded because I want to focus on recurring revenues and a sustainable budget. And what this chart shows is, with the exception of 1 year in Wilkes-Barre and 1 year in Reading, all of these cities are operating at a structural deficit. The gray bar is showing the 4 prior years, and the green bar is showing the most recent year. But it's obvious that expenses are exceeding revenues in each of these cities. And like I said, these cities are operating at a structural deficit. And I think this, honestly, if I ended the presentation here, that would be okay, because this circumstance really influences what you see on the next 5 slides. The next one is, does the city have an adequate level of savings that it can tap into if the need arises? And the chart shows the ratio of unreserved general fund balance to general fund revenues. So the city's general fund is what it uses to cover day-to-day operations, and the balance in the general fund is just a difference between the assets and the liabilities. The cities would like to have as much of that unreserved as they can, meaning there aren't any external limitations on the way they can use the money in their general fund. And the way I like to think of this is, take it to a household or a personal level. How much of your income would you like to have in savings as a rainy day fund in case of some sort of financial crisis or uneven cash flows? You lose a job, you need to buy a new hot water heater. You want to have something in reserve to cover that, right? I couldn't find there was no median available, sort of what's typical in the data set that I used, but I did find through another source that generally 18% is typical for cities. They want to have about 18% of their general fund revenues in their general fund to be used in these cases. And you can see that Lancaster, Wilkes-Barre, and Reading all exceed 20%, so they're doing relatively well relative to the average city. The rates drop as we move to the right. They're negative in Allentown and York, meaning the general fund has a negative balance. The next question is, what is the size of the city's debt relative to its population? The chart answers that question by showing the net direct debt per capita. So net direct debt excludes debt that would be repaid through a dedicated revenue stream and only includes debt that would be repaid through general revenues. And this shows that compared to the median, all of these cities have pretty high levels of debt. Altoona is very close, around $500 per capita. It goes up from there all the way to $2,000 in Wilmington. I should mention that Harrisburg is oftentimes not shown on these charts because of some special situations I won't get into. They are particularly struggling, and they are literally off the charts in some cases. Net direct debt per capita in Harrisburg was over $6,000. It's also important to note that net direct debt in the most recent year is higher than in 2008 for all 10 cities. Also, pay attention to the first 3 cities, Altoona, Allentown, and Lancaster. On this chart, you'll see the same 3 cities on the left. So to what degree does yesterday's debt consume today's resources? And this shows the ratio of current debt service to total expenses. So of all the money going out for each of these cities, how much is going to pay down debt? Altoona, it's around 5%. It's below 10% in Lancaster and Allentown, to 25% in York. Now, again, I was unable to find sort of what's the typical or what's ideal for these cities. But I think it goes without saying that the less that a city can dedicate to yesterday's debt, the more it can spend on providing services today and improving the quality of life for its citizens. The 5th question is, has the city adequately kept up with its pension obligations? And then the chart shows the pension funded ratio for 2009 and 2011. So every year or two, a city undertakes an actuarial analysis of its pension, and somebody much smarter than I am crunches the numbers and figures out the value of the assets in the pension fund and compares it to the present value of all the accrued liabilities, all the pension liabilities that the city can expect from its current employees and those who have retired. And it, like I said, it compares the two. And you'd like to see, ideally, the ratio at 100%, right? You'd like to think that the city has as much in its pension as it's going to need to spend. And you can see Harrisburg, in a good way, is an outlier in this case. It exceeds 100%, 114. I've heard actuaries say that a safe minimum is 80%. And you can see Lancaster is at 83. And then the median is 73, and we have another 4 cities that are at or above the median. I don't want to rain on this parade because this is probably the most optimistic slide I'm going to show today. But it's worth noting that these ratios assume that the pensions are going to return a 7.5% to 8% return on their investment each year. And that's not specific to these cities. That's sort of the industry standard. And the extent to which they don't return 7.5% to 8%, these ratios exaggerate how healthy they are. And it's just worth keeping in mind, I think. And then lastly, what share of the city's annual budget is allocated to pension and other retirement costs? And the chart shows the ratio of pension and other post-employment benefits contributions to general fund expenditures. So cities aren't just setting aside money to cover future pension obligations, but they also have to pay for other post-employment benefits, the bulk of which comes in the form of health care expenses for retirees. As the chart shows, when you take those pension obligations and you add into it these other post-employment benefit contributions, represents anywhere from 11 to 25% of the total general fund expenditures. The median is 13. Wilkes-Barre is below the median, but Lancaster through Altoona, you see numbers much higher, 18 to 25%. It's also worth mentioning that whereas cities pre-fund their pension accounts, we saw those funded ratios at 60 to 114%, they don't generally pre-fund these other post-employment benefit accounts. They only pay the expenses as they come in each year. So essentially they have funded ratios of 0, right, because there are no assets in the account. And that also is a pretty significant concern, not just for these cities, but for cities generally. So to this point, I think I've delivered on my promise of providing a pretty unoptimistic presentation. We've seen that cities are operating at structural deficits. They've taken on pretty significant levels of debt, and a lot of the resources are going to paying down that debt and to paying legacy costs. So what are the implications for community development? Before I move on to that, I want to make sure we're using the same operating definition for community development. Cities generally undertake activities using local, state, and federal funds to improve the built environment, generally in low and moderate income communities that get classified, these activities, these expenses get classified as community development in their financial reports. So we're talking about things like housing rehab, affordable housing development, zoning, code enforcement, inspections, but things that generally make a place more livable. So using that definition, this chart shows that community development expenditures have fallen in 7 of the 9 cities between 2008 and 2012. There were slight upticks in Reading and in Wilmington, a larger uptick in Wilmington. But generally, overall, the expenditures fell from $87 million to $70 million over this period. It's a decline of 19%. So one question I would ask if I were you is, what happened to total expenditures? Right? If total expenditures fell by 25%, then community development held up pretty well. And in fact, total expenditures were flat. Right? So community development certainly took a much larger hit. And why would that be? It could be that they're being crowded out by other expenses. We saw other post-employment benefit and pension costs going up. But the primary culprit, I think, is a retrenchment of federal support. Cities are very reliant on federal funding to conduct these community development activities. And the tables show allocations from HUD's Office of Community Planning and Development grant programs. So we're talking about CDBG, HOME, HOPWA, et cetera. And on a city-by-city basis, these contributions between 2003 and 2012 fell by anywhere from 47 to 66%. And the total fell from 52 to 24% over this period. And so what's a city to do, right? I don't know that I don't have any good answers how they should address this in the long term. But cities have come up with ways to balance their budget annually on paper, if not in fact. So some common responses include reducing the size and cost of government, deferring their contributions to pensions and other post-employment benefits, deferring infrastructure investment, increasing taxes and fees, relying on reserves and debt. For me, though, all these solutions have two things in common. The first is that they're focused on the short term and they represent patches instead of long-term solutions. And the second is each one really makes a city less competitive with its peers because these cities are competing for prospective residents and businesses. So others have provided ideas for ways that the states could assist their cities. States obviously provide direct support and aid, but they also provide indirect support that can be just as important. They create the fiscal context in which these cities operate. So some have suggested that cities provide financial assistance to deal with their legacy pension and health care costs. Others have suggested recognizing that shrinking cities have a diminished economic base, a tax base, to provide equalization grants to local governments. Redoubling efforts to promote regional cooperation and shared services, so helping cities create efficiencies and actually do more with less. Instituting a better system of fiscal oversight, and then removing limits on revenue-raising tools, either making more tools available or removing restrictions that blunt their effectiveness. I should mention that Pennsylvania and Delaware have each tried one or more of these, and as we've seen in these charts, they haven't been sufficient to put these cities on sound fiscal footing. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Andy and David to get some better ideas on more constructive and creative ways that we could help these cities.
Good morning, everybody. And thank you, Keith, for being a good bridge between the pessimistic and hopefully a little bit of the optimistic that we can show off in New Orleans. I think most of the strategies that you've described are things that we've been wrestling with for the last couple of years. When you said Merit Research did some work, they did some work that included a feature profile of New Orleans in the Wall Street Journal last year that showed us as one of 5 cities in the country of a certain size that had a negative fund balance. So you're talking about what the fund balance, the savings account of a city ought to be. At 18%, ours would be $100 million. So at the end of the last fiscal year, ours was negative $18 million. What that really means is that we're paying last month's bills with next month's money. And that's what we do. And I've spent a lot of the last few years triaging cash. When Mayor Landry, my boss, took office in May of 2010, we had inherited a $97 million spending gap. What that meant was that for every $5 we spent, we took in $4 in revenue. You can only do that while your savings account is robust. And the prior mayor and city council were spending one-time federal loans and state loans and spending down the savings account after Katrina. In a moment of desperation, you got to do what you got to do. And so for those of you who are in local government, you understand the position that the prior administration was in. But from my perspective, that was in 2005, 2006, 2007, but it certainly wasn't in 2008 and 2009 and 2010. And so by the time we took office, our spending pattern was as you see, and our revenue pattern was as you see, and there was no money left. So what we had to do was cut, and get creative. And so the first step in our effort, is there a way I can get rid of this little sign here that seems to be a click, sign, add text, I guess. Maybe I won't do that. But so our first step was to eliminate, was to reverse the spending trend. And what you'll see is that we have now been, for the last 4 years, spending about 8 to 10% less on an annual basis than the city spent in 2009. The second step, so we're talking about strategies. We cut spending, we raised revenues. And so we had to raise taxes. We raised property taxes. We doubled the city's sanitation fee, and we raised a slew of other things so that we could do more with less, but not completely abandon the investments that the city was making. Again, we cut spending 8 to 10%. We raised revenues by about 10 to 12%. We had the good fortune of rising property values due to rising property taxes due to properly assessing our properties. And the city of New Orleans is now living within its means. So our margins, when you can't spend your savings account, you have no choice but to live within your means. And so that effort at fiscal discipline helped us. We cut, we raised revenues, and now we have excluded the vast majority of the one-time money from our budget and are operating on a sustainable basis where recurring revenues and recurring expenses are matched. And at the end of this year, we will reverse that trend that Merritt described based on reviewing our financial statements to eliminate our negative fund balance. And so what you see, I like to say that the accountants are historians. And for the most of the last couple of years, our fund balance has reflected the previous slides that I showed. You know, we were, again, upside down in our fund balance. We were spending money that we didn't have a recurring replacement source for, and the picture appeared in the annual financial statements. It didn't tell the story of the future, which is the one we kept trying to tell, which is our path forward to sustainability. We're, in fact, going to end 2013 not at negative 4.5 million, which we predicted, but about positive 9 million. So we improved our performance by about $14 million in our unaudited books that will be completed at the end of the year. And we have a path forward to growing that fund balance back. And how did we do it? Oh, good. Oh, there it is. Okay. Perfect. Good. Thank you very much. So our philosophy to try to make sure that we made the smart choices that Keith described was to cut smart, to reorganize, and to invest. Because I think really if we're paying for the past, we're not investing in growing the city for the future. And so we had to do those things that made sense. And so again, we eliminated millions of dollars worth of contractual spending. One of the key decisions that Keith highlighted in his presentation came on retiree health care. If you'll see on the far right slide, the third bullet down, we shifted retiree health care to Medicare. All of our city employees are paying into Social Security. They're all Medicare eligible. We've been paying the taxes, and they have been paying the taxes for Medicare. Yet, even though folks were Medicare eligible, we were covering, as the city being the primary insurer. We were essentially cost shifting to us from Uncle Sam. Well, that's nice when you've got the money to do it. We were desperate and had to do something that was pretty significant, and that's probably saved us $5 to $7 million a year. But that's a evergreen source of savings. It's going to save us a lot of money going forward. Another thing that was just kind of common basic sense was you can't spend an unlimited amount of overtime on borrowed money. And so we cut the overtime expenditures by 2/3 from about $30 million in 2009, and it stabilized at about $12 or $13 million a year. Took back take-home cars, all the sorts of things that you have to do when you've got to squeeze money out of the system. We reorganized. We combined departments. We eliminated boards and commissions. We did a lot of public-private partnerships for recreation and for business development. And then we tried to invest in the things that were important to the city. Primarily, those investments were in public safety agencies, but also in trying to improve our code enforcement and invest in the kinds of things that make cities money. So we hired more revenue agents. We hired more folks to go inspect vacant property so that we could move that market. We hired more folks to write traffic tickets. Again, if it generated money, we made those investments. If it didn't, we tried to pull back. And so the story is that we're starting to make some progress externally. Our bond rating is improved. This is an interesting picture about where are our long-term liabilities. And I don't have the per capita GO debt, but this slide illustrates that our GO debt as a city has been decreasing, but the expenses that are increasing the pressure on the city budget have largely been pension and legal pressures. Our pension funded ratios for the city fund are just as an example, about 75%, so right at that median. But our police department is in a statewide pension fund, which is about 60% funded, and our fire department, which is sort of the albatross on our financial neck, is less than 40% funded. And that is one of the huge pressures that we face, both financially and, in this case, it's the subject of considerable litigation in New Orleans. Another couple examples that Keith highlighted: where do cities go to be able to set their own destiny? One of the things that has cost us dearly is, you can see this is the history going back to 1986 on federal community development block grant funding. And again, it is just 60% of what it was at its high years. We did another analysis that's not, I don't have a chart for it, but we have become very good friends with the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, who has sued us about our jail, has sued us about our police department, who's, and they keep asking us to make changes that we need to make to fix things. And their sense of urgency we share. Their sense of financial participation in fixing these problems is almost zero. And so in the 90s, you may remember President Clinton's 100,000 new police officer initiative. We were getting substantially more money from the Department of Justice to local government. Federal funding at the Department of Justice to support local government has declined 87% since the late 90s. So we get 13 cents on the dollar as a city from the Department of Justice from things like the COPS program and other discretionary federal programs that we used to. And so that's even more significant than the loss of CDBG funding. David, I think, is going to talk a little bit about the state-city relationship. I heard Governor Rendell speak yesterday about a 3.7% wage tax that Philadelphia has. In Louisiana, we have nothing like that. And so we are much more constrained in our ability. There's no income taxing provision local government has. We have property tax and we have sales tax, and those are limited. You see that we only retain 28% of the local sales tax generated, and we only retain 12% of the local hotel motel tax generated. Now, some of the recipients are state agencies that work locally, like the Superdome, like our local convention center. But it's hard to say that we can control the future of the city when a revenue source like a hotel motel tax is imposed by the state and retained by a state agency that doesn't share our sense of urgency around the problems that need to be fixed in the city. Another area where you see reductions, and not all these things are negative. This one may be positive. We're trying to do more with less. That means less people. We've got about half the number of employees we had 30 years ago. And on a per 10,000 basis, obviously we lost a significant amount of population. With Katrina, we're down from 480,000 in 2000 to now we're back to about 379,000. So we've come back a long way, but we're still 20% below our 2000 census level. Yet, part of my job here was to be optimistic. And there's a lot of reason to be optimistic despite the trends. And part of what we've been doing in New Orleans is trying to be our most immediate laboratory for innovation and change. And the city of New Orleans is actually on a considerable role. It would be worth noting that for the last 3 or 4 years, we've been the fastest growing city in the country, according to the Census Bureau. Forbes called us the biggest brain magnet. Brookings called us #1 for economic recovery. Bloomberg News called us the top American boomtown. The Daily Beast spoke about us as the #2 most aspirational city. Our unemployment rate is 4.5% compared to the national average of 6.3%. We're creating thousands of jobs, and the city is dynamic. It feels like everything is turning up in the right direction. So starting with our city finances, but job growth, economic growth, property tax values are going up. And part of that is because of the way we have invested significant amounts of federal recovery money. And so I'm going to describe a little bit about how we choose to do this neighborhood by neighborhood, but you see a little outline of one neighborhood we're going to talk about particularly in how we've tried to bring all the investments to the same place at the same time in a coherent way that's going to build strength for the city's economy for years to come. And so what we tried to do was really focus on revitalizing 6 urban core neighborhoods. So this is the 7th Ward, it's Treme, it's Iberville, it's Lafitte if you've been to New Orleans, it is Mid-City, and it is the French Quarter. All border this outlined area here. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the investments. So we reopened historic Armstrong Park, Louis Armstrong Park. It's right at the edge of the French Quarter with a significant amount of investment in that park. It's a historic sacred place. It includes Congo Square, which is where all the slave auctions occurred in New Orleans history. So it's both a public place but also a place of remembrance. We also restored, with federal funds, a public health clinic. And it is part of a system of about 70 public health clinics that we created after Katrina to address the community's needs. And so we got a federal grant to provide primary care to low-income folks. It was our version of the Affordable Care Act before the Affordable Care Act passed. Of course, in Louisiana, our governor is refusing to accept the Medicaid expansion. So we're possibly the only place in the country where if this grant gets cut off, people will actually lose health insurance that they previously had. It's not about keeping the health insurance you had. We got a federal grant that was a bridge to a Medicaid expansion. And if the Medicaid expansion doesn't occur, either the state has to continue to fund that, which we're fighting for, or we're going to lose that health care. We also invested here in the neighborhood. Again, you see Craig Elementary School. We got $1.8 billion worth of federal money to rebuild schools. So Craig Elementary is a school that we took and rehabbed. So it's essentially gutting the school in a historic neighborhood and bringing it back to life right where it was, so we didn't move it. And it's part of a system of charter schools in New Orleans that is transforming the community and I think setting the world on fire in terms of how an urban school district can reinvent itself. So 90% of New Orleans children are in charter schools. It's the highest percentage in the country. Our test scores are going up. Our graduation rates are going up. Our dropout rates are going down. And it is the place where there's the biggest achievement gap closure in the country. We're also investing substantially in our recreation facilities. You see the Treme Center and Hunters Field, about $130 million capital investment in different recreation facilities is being made. And it's part of a public-private partnership where we're raising significant sums of external money to support recreation for the kids of New Orleans. We also are using some money to create a greenway. And this is a linear park on an old railroad bed. Not a lot of this has been done in places like New Orleans, but this is going to link these neighborhoods and create a vibrant linear park in the city. It's our version of the High Line. And it's connecting all the new neighborhoods. You can see the pictures. This goes from the French Quarter to Bayou St. John and City Park for those of you who've been to New Orleans. We're also rethinking our public housing. So after Katrina, in one of the two decisions, I think chartering all the schools was one, changing the footprint of public housing was the second, that fundamentally transformed the future of New Orleans. And so we had no mixed income multifamily public housing. We took the big four housing developments that were built in the 30s and 40s. We redeveloped some of the properties, raised a lot of them, spread out in the neighborhoods in high-quality, mixed-income multifamily developments that you see on the bottom. The new public housing developments, which were privately managed and higher quality and much less dense in terms of the concentration of poverty. The last of the housing developments is Iberville. which is right on the edge of the French Quarter. It was notorious in the 90s as the hot spot for crime and homicide. And we got a $30 million choice neighborhood grant that we competed for with HUD and are now in the process of redeveloping that right at the foot of that picture. We're also rebuilding in New Orleans 2 hospitals. One of them is the New University Hospital, which is the state's hospital for the 2 medical schools, and that's a $1 billion facility at the edge of this neighborhood. And likewise, the Veterans Administration is building another $1 billion hospital next door. So you've got $2 billion worth of hospitals being developed. We believe that over the next 20 years, that's going to create about 17,000 jobs and about $10 billion worth of wages paid at those facilities. And so, again, hope for new jobs and investment. The Sanger Theater was another place where we took about $9 million worth of federal funds and we invested in a new theater with about $40 million in historic tax credits and private funds to bring back a legendary theater on Canal Street. We've also invested significantly in bikeways, streetscapes, and streetcars. So we got a new $75 million streetcar that's come in down Loyola Avenue with a Tiger grant that we competed for, and we've built 100 miles worth of bike paths in the city as part of our Complete Streets program in the last 9 years. And we're continuing to invest in infrastructure. We're bringing back retail. So we heard yesterday about Brown supermarkets. In New Orleans, we did a similar fresh foods initiative and brought back the Circle Food Store and brought in a Whole Foods in the same inner city neighborhood area. And when you put those pieces together, you have a dynamic investment in the heart of historic New Orleans that we think is going to attract population, job creation, and support our development as we move forward to our 300-year anniversary. The last thing I want to show you is a picture of our new airport terminal, which is going to be online by 2018, which again is the city's 300th anniversary. So we're taking the time to cut the spending and invest in things that we think are going to pay dividends long term. And again, if you haven't seen anything since the footage of Katrina, New Orleans is a completely transformed city in the last 9 years. We took the opportunity to take devastation, seize the moment, and change our city in the most important ways while preserving also the most important things about it. So thank you very much.
Great. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to try and wrap this up so that we get to your questions and some interaction among the panel members. I did want to ask one question and was curious about this. How many folks in the audience work for a local government, work for a city, county government? Okay. How many folks work in foundations or sort of the nonprofit sector or philanthropic sector in some of these sorts of cities? Okay. So I wanted to do a couple of things this morning to sort of wrap this up and echo both some of the things that Andy said about New Orleans and some of the trends that Keith detected in his research about older cities in Pennsylvania. Let me start by talking sort of about the topic itself and what do we really mean when we talk about doing more with less. The first thing I think I want to say is we don't necessarily mean what lots of cities have done, which is to do less with less. And Keith really talked about that a little bit in his research in terms of how cities have dealt with some of the fiscal challenges that they face. So that I'll talk at the end, I hope, a little bit about the National Resource Network and the work that we're going to be doing in cities across the country. But we're in talking to cities, we find ourselves calling lots of cities on Fridays and getting the message that's all too common that the city of X is not open for business today. So that cities have not just cut back certain services, they've gone to the four-day work week. So that's That's not necessarily what we're talking about when we're talking about more, doing more with less. I think what we're really talking about is both thinking about how to do different things as a local government, as a city, and how to do some of the things that cities have always done differently. So really rethinking certain strategies in terms of the delivery of basic services, how cities approach critical areas of policy, and really achieving fundamental reforms in certain areas of spending. I think what you really heard in both Keith's remarks and Andy's remarks is local governments have actually gotten really good over the last couple of decades in cutting budgets. It's because given the constraints in federal spending, local budget officials have had a lot of practice at cutting budgets. The key, though, is that for cities, particularly recovering cities, the goal of the local government can't just be to balance the budget, though that's essential. The question is, both what are you doing with those savings, and how do you sort of get onto a trajectory of overall recovery? And the last point, and I think it really goes to the heart of some of Keith's research and really the conclusion of what Andy talked about, is this isn't an either-or proposition, right? I've heard a lot of times, and having lived in two cities that have succeeded at recovery over different periods in very different cities, New York City and Chattanooga, a lot of cities sort of see this as a choice, right? Well, we've either got to deal with our fiscal issues, or we've got to figure out what to do in terms of revitalizing our economy. And I think most older cities don't have that choice. As Keith suggested, the biggest barrier to community development in a lot of these places are all of the fiscal issues that local government faces. On the other hand, the key to success in New Orleans is not just the sort of fiscal stewardship that's been applied over the last couple of years. It's all of the reinvestment and recovery that Andy talked about. So sort of starting from this notion of more with less by doing things differently, Peter Orszag, who was head of both the Congressional Budget Office and I guess head of OMB under the Obama administration for a while, has talked about this notion of government playing Moneyball. And he talks about the old Willie Sutton quote, Willie Sutton's asked, why do you rob banks? That's where the money is. So that the focus at the federal level on healthcare was not just a substantive policy focus, it was also a fiscal focus, right? So that unless you were able to begin to deal with some of the costs of healthcare in the United States, trying to deal with other aspects of the budget would be somewhat fruitless. So the equivalent, if you will, to where the money is at the local government level are really in two areas that I think Keith talked a little bit about in his presentation, sort of on the public safety side and in pension costs. So to the extent that we want to think about doing things differently as a way to deal with some of the fiscal constraints that local governments face, it's pretty important to look in those areas. So let me start by talking a little bit about fire departments, which are appropriately much respected and much beloved in most communities. Michael Lewis, who you may remember wrote Moneyball, also wrote a book called Boomerang, where he went around to different financially and fiscally troubled places around the world, and he actually ended his book by going to California. And talking to folks in Vallejo, California, which before Stockton, before Detroit, before Jefferson County, Alabama, had gone bankrupt a couple of years ago. And he talked to the fire chief there, who was obviously dealing with much more limited resources than his predecessor had had. And he talked about the fact that I've just come to realize that we can't do the fire service the way that we've always done it in Vallejo, California. So we've really got to rethink the way that we approach firefighting. That is not a common theme that you hear about most fire departments, even though I guess what I would argue is that it should be. So the graph that some of you may be able to see at the bottom of this chart actually tells in what in some respects has been a little bit of a gloomy presentation this morning, a really great story, right, which is the decline of fires in the United States over the last 30 years or so. Total fires in the United States are down by about 56%, and structural fires are down by about the same. The issue, though, is that most local fire departments have not really responded to this, right? So that they're actually doing less with the same amount or doing less with more when it comes to firefighting. And there are a number of different reasons for that. Unlike police departments, for example, fire departments generally are less reliant on using data to adjust deployment strategies. But the big story is that the fire service is actually an area where local governments can and are starting to look for potential savings to legitimately do more with less, to sort of restructure the way, or to echo the words of the fire chief in Vallejo, to rethink the way that they approach firefighting. Whether it's adopting more of a prevention type of approach to fires, which is a little less dependent on personnel and therefore a little less costly, whether it's figuring out other things that the fire service can and is doing in a lot of places widely around emergency medical services, but also increasingly around code enforcement activities, and even in some cities combining certain fire service and police service activity, or, as Keith pointed out, sort of looking at opportunities for shared services or regional services in the fire service. So one example in the public safety area where cities can do more with less would be the fire service. A similar sort of issue is when it comes to local corrections. Again, here are some good news numbers to talk about. Between 1995, crime is down. Crime is down dramatically across the United States. And arrests were actually down by about 13% during that same period. However, over time, local jail population was increasing, and increasing at considerable cost. Most of the people who were in jail, increasingly in jail, were not people who had been convicted of anything. Right? Jails both hold people before trial, and they hold, in most cases, locally convicted offenders. During this same period, actually, the percentage of people who were in local jails who had not yet been convicted of anything was up by about 5 percentage points. There was a cost to this increase in local incarceration. So over roughly the same period of time, local correction costs were up by about 20% more than overall local government costs, based on some of the data that's collected by the Census Bureau. Again, local correction issues, usually issues for county governments, places like New Orleans, and actually here in Philadelphia, where the city effectively operates as the county as well. Other places have looked at this and actually been able to control those costs with a series of innovative approaches that range from processing criminal cases more effectively, different policing policies in terms of who gets arrested versus who gets a citation or a summons, alternatives to incarceration, introducing pretrial programs, and also investing in reentry programs. Let me try and talk about local government pensions in a minute and a half. So it's a big problem, as Keith suggested. It's a rising problem for most local governments in terms of the cost to government, and it's one that usually is fraught with political issues and controversy anytime you attempt to change it. This is my hometown fire and police pension fund. And what you see is that over time, much as Keith had suggested, the percentage of the funded level of the pension fund has gone down, and gone down rather dramatically, up at around 100% at around 2000, getting to a point down to around 63% in 2012. In some cases, this is the result of doing, as Keith suggested, some cities do, which is deferring their required payments to keep the fund fully funded. But actually, that wasn't the case in Chattanooga. So that pretty much every year consistently, the city was paying what's known as the annual required contribution. So it was more a function of changes in the market, pension funds are invested, and just rapid increases in cost of providing benefits. So Chattanooga decided that this was not a sustainable situation from a financial perspective. The local government convinced the fire and police unions that they would actually have to come to the table and negotiate changes, because it was all well and good to have a fire and police pension fund, but if the reality was the city was never going to be able to pay for the benefits that it was supposed to provide, it didn't do the members of the unions much good as well. And the city and the local unions were actually, through more of a consensus process than an adversarial process, were able to come to an agreement that achieved about $227 million in savings over time for the city of Chattanooga, put the pension fund on a solid footing, and ensure that members actually have the benefits that they were now being promised. Again, more with less by doing different things in terms of the structure of the pension fund. I'm going to not talk a great deal about social impact bonds, other than to say that part of what local governments have to do is to focus hard on investments that result in prevention. You know, it's way better to build a guardrail at the top of a fiscal cliff than to station ambulances below. So that if you could do certain things to reduce costs, whether it's around recidivism or through investment in early childhood programs, those are smart investments that can save money in the long run. So let me contextualize this a little bit in the example of one city, and that would be the city of Baltimore. So remember, just as Keith suggested, we can't just look at this from the pure lens of finances and a balanced budget. And as Andy laid out in terms of what the city of New Orleans is doing, its greatest success is not just moving toward a better model in terms of fiscal sustainability. It's the type of investment and activity that's going on through investment in certain neighborhoods. The city of Baltimore is doing something interesting. It's adopted a 10-year plan. And it's a 10-year plan that both seeks to achieve better fiscal and financial outcomes with a focus on some of the exact costs that I talked about, but also with a very clear goal as to how those savings are going to be achieved once they get beyond just balancing their budget, once they get beyond just dealing with their structural issues. So that the mayor of Baltimore has actually said her goal is, again, addressing one of the issues that Keith discussed, she wants to add 10,000 new families to the city of Baltimore, bring people back to the city of Baltimore over a 10-year period of time. She knows you got to get to a balanced budget and you got to close structural deficits to get to the ability to deliver the sorts of services that the city wants to continue to provide. But she also wants to use savings to begin to deal with some of the vacant property issues in Baltimore and that are very common in some of the older industrial cities. She also wants to take some of those savings and apply them in a strategic way to investments over the 10-year period of time. So let me conclude with the 30-second ad for the National Resource Network. So here's what I could say in 10 seconds about states. They're not often very good partners for local governments in trying to do any of these things. I grew up in New York and am a reformed now non-practicing lawyer, and I can't remember the case, but there's a great case in New York state law that refers to city as mere political subdivisions of the state. Not just political subdivisions, mere political subdivisions. And I think certainly when I was in New York City and had friends in Albany, that's very much how they thought of local government. But across all of these issues, right, there are certain in many states you can't achieve the type of reforms that I talked about in terms of pension costs without without the cooperation of state government. You can't do the sorts of things that you'd like to do in terms of criminal justice reform without the cooperation and participation of state officials. And the state has, in most cases, or in many cases, has certainly not been the best of partners in doing these sorts of difficult things. You could say the same thing about the federal government. I've told my new colleagues at the federal government that when I was a local government official, I generally had two types of conversations with the federal government. Give me the money, or don't fine me the money for doing something wrong. I think through the Obama administration's Strong Cities, Strong Communities initiative, there's an effort actually that hopefully states will replicate to be more of a partner in understanding and working to achieve some of the sorts of economic turnarounds that a lot of cities are working toward. I'll talk more about the National Resource Network in the Q&A if folks ask me about it. Really what it is my firm, PFM, along with a number of other firms that are really experts across community development, economic development issues, as well as academia and ICMA, are working together with $10 million in initial seed funding from the federal government to provide a new set of services to local governments that are trying to overcome the sorts of challenges that we've talked about this morning by applying best practices and by providing the sort of partnership that hasn't been common enough either at the state level or the federal level. So I'll wrap it there.
Thank you. Sorry, I can't see anything. There we go. So we're going to turn it over for questions in a couple minutes. I have lots of questions. I hope you do too. I think the way we're going to handle this is I'm going to kick it off by asking sort of an open question to all of you and sort of give you all time to collect your thoughts and think about what you want to know further from our speakers. There's a microphone in the middle of the room, and ask that you just approach the microphone, introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, and then hopefully get to your question as quickly as possible so that we can get in as many as possible. So my kickoff question is directed to all of you, and so I invite anybody to jump in and give your opinion on this. I know at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, we're wrapping up the first phase of what we've called our Industrial Cities Initiative, which has been a study of 10 Midwestern post-industrial cities, largely smaller cities. And I'm always reminded of speaking to one of the mayors in these cities and asking her how she defines success. And she defines it as the halting of decline. And I think that's a very tough message to have to while it's a laudable message, and I commend her greatly if she's able to do that, I imagine that's a tough sell. And so, Andy, in your remarks, you talked about how one tells the story of the future, and I'm wondering how, as leaders, you can do that, especially if that future, in any positive way, might be quite remote. At the end of the day, municipal leaders need to get reelected in order to implement what they wish to do. And sometimes that news, when people are expecting a Starbucks on every corner, and you perhaps have more practical things that need to be done, how do you talk about that?
I'll jump in on that one.
Yeah.
And I think the job of a local elected leader in a older community is as tough as one as there is. And I was just struck by by Governor Rendell's simplicity as describing the benefit of a tax increment financing district yesterday. He said if they don't come, the tax value of that property is zero. If they come and develop it, you'll get the money in 10 years. That's a much better trade-off. And what he did was simplify the message. And I happen to work for an incredibly gifted political leader who is as good a communicator as I've seen in my career at talking to the public. And we've had to tell a very difficult message to the public, which is that, our city's broke. We're going to have to raise your taxes. We're going to have to cut back in services. And yet, as you said, Susan, put it in a context that inspires people to roll up their sleeves and dive in and do it. And I think that if you say stemming the decline is your message, it's hard to get hope and inspiration. And hope is, I think, the candle that keeps burning. Whenever, if you've got hope and optimism, you can knock, over immovable objects. And so part of the job of a local elected leader has got to be to inspire folks with a great vision and to tell people how, in concrete ways, we're going to get there. What are we going to do? And I think that you've got to go speak, we speak truth to power to the state. We speak truth to power to the feds. We speak truth to power to the citizens of New Orleans and tell them, look, it's going to be hard. This is what we got to do. You're going to have to do more. But if you can tell the story the right way and show concrete progress, I think there's a way to do it. But I do think as elected officials in this environment, that is the toughest job there is in America, is to be able, because you're asking folks literally to pay more and sacrifice in the hopes of some vision down the road.
David?
I mean, I would add two things. I think that precisely the points that Andy talks about are were part of the theory behind Baltimore doing a 10-year plan as opposed to doing a 5-year plan. Because if you ask the mayor why 10 years, why not 5 years, it's more common. Part of the issue is she wanted everybody to understand that, it's going to take a couple of years to get to where we need to get to achieve this sort of basics, but then here's the hope, here's the opportunity at the end. And the other thing that I would say, and it's the sort of what I bring to this work, is, I think that there is a lot of conversation in a lot of places about cities, probably some of the cities that are represented here today, that our hope is to stem the decline. And I think there's a lot of sense out there that, particularly in places that have seen population decline over decades, that really that is the only possible outcome. And I don't know if I'm more optimistic or less fatalistic, but look, when I was a kid growing up in Brooklyn, the word of the day was the words of the day were planned shrinkage. And the fact that there were neighborhoods we could close schools and close subway stations because there was just no way that people were ever going to come back to those places. Those places are now known as Bushwick and Williamsburg, and places where if I moved back to New York, there's no way I would be able to afford an apartment or house to live there. And you can say, well, that's New York. Well, I moved from New York to a place called Chattanooga, Tennessee, which is, I think, closer to a lot of the smaller, mid-sized cities that are very much some of the places that Keith was talking about. Chattanooga is a city that lost 10% of its population in the 1980s. It was a Rust Belt city in the middle of the Sun Belt. It took a lot of effort, but it has started to turn around. It has started to regain population. So I guess part of the message that doesn't get out there nearly often enough is there are examples of turnarounds, right? This is something that can be accomplished. For places that have seen decline for 20 or 30 or 40 years, it is not something that's going to take place over 3 or 4 or 5 years, but there actually is a path out of the decline.
Okay.
And if I could just jump in. So we recently published a report called Out of the Shadow, and it was based on the interviews that Alan Malik and I were doing throughout our district that led to this fiscal report that we published. And in this Out of the Shadow report, Alan proposes 6 strategies for change for these cities. And they include strategies like incremental change and strategic vision, resilience, inclusive leadership, creating an opportunity structure. But the report isn't concerned at all with how cities sort of fund these measures. It's a great blueprint for what to do, but not necessarily how to fund it. And in my mind, given what I've seen with the 10 cities I studied, it would be next to impossible for these cities to rebound in a significant way by themselves, without partnerships, whether they're public-private partnerships or whether it's through support from their state and federal government. Andy talked about a lot of really incredible things going on in New Orleans, but a lot of them seem to involve federal government. So the VA hospital and Tiger grants and public housing, Those are things that are happening both through New Orleans leadership, but also with federal support.
So if I can indulge myself in asking a perfect follow-on question, it's almost like Keith set it up for me, is what is in the light of the declining federal support, what is the role of the private sector in all of this, and how do you engage with them? And I'm talking beyond simply grant-making or philanthropy, but really how do you engage with the private sector in making sure that they are a partner in this story and a partner in this vision, and eventually make those investments that may or may not help to fill that gap?
So I think that, so I'm going to broaden it from the private sector to the sort of philanthropic sector, the civic sector in cities. I think, as Keith suggests, and as sort of Andy's remarks about New Orleans suggest, that it's critical, right? So part of this, and this is a little bit of recovering City 101, is figuring out what your competitive assets are and who your major employers are and how you begin to work and engage with those folks to help to rebuild your city and rebuild the local economy. In New Orleans, some of the story may be around, federal investment. In Chattanooga, some of the story was certainly around nonprofit sector investment as well. But I guess I want to attack the premise of the question for a second, which is I actually think that the federal government invests a fair number and a fair amount of resources in a lot of these places. But part of the issue is that in those cities that don't have the kind of capacity that New Orleans has developed and that Keith and I have talked about, those investments aren't sometimes not as well spent or in as focused way as they're being done now in New Orleans. And that part of what the National Resource Network hopes to do is to work with cities to both identify assets, whether they be federal funds or local philanthropic or private sector investments, and sort of put them on the kind of visionary path that Keith was talking about. So, I think the federal government doesn't spend nearly as much as they used to, but you also hear from federal officials in particular about, in some places, millions of dollars being left on the table or being spent the wrong way. So I think there's a way to do more there as well.
If I can jump in a couple thoughts. The conversation, again, yesterday afternoon I thought was instructive in terms of the role of the public and private sector talking about how you make investments and how do you tell people that a local TIF is a good idea. That's a communication problem. Keith was reminding us just a moment ago that a lot of New Orleans' success, I'll take issue a little bit with David's comment about the federal government giving enough. We happen to be the beneficiaries of both stimulus money and disaster recovery money to the tune of, billions of dollars. It has made all the difference in the world. If you want proof that federal stimulus money works, that federal infrastructure investments work, look no further than New Orleans. It is booming. And yet we are losing, I think, the national debate about the validity and worthiness of federal investments in infrastructure and in cities. So Ms. Mester, the new Cleveland Federal Reserve president, said yesterday, cities, in her introductory remarks, cities are economic accelerators. They're very efficient places for job creation. Well, that panel yesterday was a great argument for the kinds of investments that ought to be made. It's part of the conversation. If mayors have to tell their constituents, you're going to have to roll up your sleeves and do tough things, our federal officials and our business leaders and our philanthropic leaders need to tell the federal officials in Congress and elsewhere, stop being ridiculous about bad economics. I mean, it's absolutely clear that the long-term investments in infrastructure and those federal investments in stimulus worked. I mean, it just is crystal clear. And again, come to New Orleans and see it. We did not recover just because we've got a talented leadership and a good administration and the most resilient people on earth. That all helped. But what really, really made the difference was having a ton of money and investing it wisely.
So during the course of our interviews with some of the mayors in the region, we were talking to the mayor of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and he really illustrated to me the power of the anchor institutions in Lancaster. And I think that cities could potentially expand the definition of what is an anchor and apply the same strategies. So he said that Franklin and Marshall College and Lancaster General Hospital have really bought into the fact that they're only going to be successful if their city is successful. They only thrive if their city thrives. And they've made real contributions to the city, invested in the city, and it really does lift all boats. So potentially applying that same strategy, I think, in my mind, the same strategy would work for large businesses. To the extent that they can improve the neighborhoods in which they work, improve the financial stability of their employees, improve their employees' skills, you would see those dividends in the city's budget ultimately.
Okay. Other questions from the audience? We have a few more minutes. I want to make sure we get to some of them. So just take your place. And
Joe Schilling with the Metropolitan Institute. So I've got a really radical question for you. And this comes from my years of experience as a municipal lawyer. So I think the case you were talking about was Hunter v. Pittsburgh, which is a U.S. Supreme Court case that said local governments are mere creatures of the state. So I agree with the strategies you've all been talking about, whether it's for New Orleans or some of the smaller cities where, hopefully the network and other opportunities to sort of seed the types of assets are there. But what do you do for the Chester PAs and the East St. Louis and really the cities that have really difficult with capacity, whether it's on the civic side or the local government side? So my question really gets to the issue of municipal receivership. Certainly in Detroit, that was a huge issue. But technically, the states could go in, as they do in other countries, and basically take over a city that is significantly distressed for a period of years to sort of get it up and running, just like a business does in receivership. And I recognize that that's politically controversial, but in terms of a policy strategy for those cities where these other types of incentive-based revitalization strategies don't work, what about municipal receivership by the states?
So a couple of things, right? So I think that one of the challenges we're going to have with the National Resource Network is there's a question of capacity and a question of willingness when you go into a particular city. And capacity you could actually work with, right? And I would argue that that's where you want to make investments, is where cities have needs in terms of capacity and you can help them. It's hard to deal with willingness. It's hard to deal with a locally elected leadership that just doesn't want to do things differently, and it's hard for the federal government or its agents, but even hard for the state government to do something. I will say that we're in Pennsylvania, and my firm actually does a lot of work as either what's known here as an Act 47 fiscal coordinator, where you kind of come in and it's not a receivership process, but where there is this intense relationship between the state and the local government to deal with basic issues. Alabama didn't have that, and Jefferson County went bankrupt. And California really doesn't have that. And you sort of look at San Bernardino and Stockton and Vallejo. So I think that there are various flavors of what that could look like, and some states have it and some states don't, and it's better to have something so that there actually is a choice to avoid fiscal bankruptcy or policy bankruptcy. But it's hard to deal with. It's harder to deal with these sorts of issues when there's no political will at the local level. I guess one other thing that I would say is, in the case of New York, I think as troubling as it was for a lot of people, the type of financial controls and other controls imposed by the state government as part of the recovery of New York City was generally a good thing as well.
And same in Washington, D.C., if we go back. Okay, thanks.
And we use Detroit as an example all the time to motivate our own folks to make tough decisions. And it's very helpful. Whether you have fiscal constraints or you just use those opportunities.
Okay, so I'm going to ask that you keep your questions concise. I'm going to invoke the executive power here and let us run over a few minutes because we started late. And also I see Jerry Boyle at the back, so I have to let him ask a question too. So
Hi, my name is Ali Shah Alaman. I'm with the University of Maryland in Baltimore. This question's for Mr. Kopplin. I've been in your city many times. I'm very fond of New Orleans. And just a question about the public housing. So now it's mixed income housing, and I was just wondering, so what happens to the people who are not able to afford to stay? Do they stay in New Orleans, or where are they going?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. The first housing redevelopments after Katrina were not one-to-one replacement. And so in some cases, what that means is that for everybody who lived in the development beforehand, there may not be the same number of housing units available. The Iberville is actually one-to-one replacement. And so for every unit of public housing that was there before, there will be one in the neighborhood. It may not be in the same building. It's a little bit spread out, but it's still a neighborhood. And it's an equity issue that we're taking very seriously. So the initial ones, I think we're 70% replaced. Everybody who wanted to come back was able to get a public housing slot, even though there was only a 70% replacement. The problem, of course, is that meant that 30% of the folks ended up somewhere else. And so we continue to repatriate the city as aggressively as we can. And thank you for your fondness for our city and for coming to visit.
Thank you.
I'm another fan of New Orleans. I'm wondering about how, say in the case of Treme, you find the resources in tight times to staff the sort of public engagement effort that something like that requires, because it's not something that, sort of working with community organizations in the private sector and neighborhoods is not something that city governments have necessarily excelled at in general, and it's probably even more important but harder to do when you're in such difficult straits. And I'm wondering, it starts with a mayor who's a great communicator, but how, when it gets down to the fairly intensive effort I would think it would take to pull off what you're doing there, how did you make that happen in city government?
Well, we organized, I guess this is to the strong city, strong communities question. The mayor kept looking around. He said, well, why is HUD doing this here, the VA's doing that there, and the workforce, the Department of Labor is doing something in different places? It was all hitting the ground at the wrong time. And literally you'd see a new health clinic going in next to a blighted piece of Department of Labor property. And he said, it all needs to hit at once if we're going to have the impact. So that's what we started doing, and all the architects and planners call it place-based development. We just stole that idea and said we're going to do it all at the same time, all in the same place, so that it will have a snowballing effect. And to the other question you asked about how are we good at it, we're not very good at some of these community building things. And so we do a lot with anchor institution partners and private sector folks. What we're really trying to do is take the fictional Miss May, who lives at the Lafitte Greenway, and train her to be a phlebotomist so she can work across the street at the new hospital. And literally, we've got people who are finding the folks in the public housing who need the jobs that are being created in their neighborhood and trying to make sure we take them. And we partnered with one of our healthcare companies, trained about 50 people in a high turnover job, and said, look, we're going to match you with this job. We're going to give you all the support you need. And the turnover rate has been cut in half, and we're giving Ms. May that job. And it's been an incredible partnership. But it's led by our private employers with our resources.
Thank you.
I think Jerry Boyle with the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, I think you may have begun to answer this question, but the theme of the conference here is about growth and opportunity. And I do want to go back to the notion of being able to do more by doing things differently. And a lot of that was about providing services and the growth side. I didn't really hear that much about the opportunity side, about how we can do things differently for the purpose of driving opportunity. And there was reference made to the panel yesterday about Governor Rendell being able to share the story about the development of the hotel and the service workers being assembled and saying how many people here are from Philadelphia, and 98% raised their hands. But he wasn't able to relate the same story about the Comcast development. So there are those lingering questions out there about the diversity and inclusion element and the opportunity side of the equation in all that you're trying to do by doing more, by doing things differently. So I'd like to have the panel's take on how you apply what you've been talking about to the opportunity, the inclusion side of the conference's theme.
Okay. So we're at the very early stages of what the National Resource Network is going to be doing in terms of providing direct assistance to certain cities. And the focus of the cities that we're going into are those cities that have the greatest economic challenges. I think it took about 30 seconds to realize that almost every place we're going into, we've got to figure out how we integrate whatever we may be doing on capacity or whatever we may be doing on operational issues to generate savings, and whatever we may be doing to be smarter about some of the infrastructure investment with. So that's great. So what are we going to do about workforce development? What are we going to do about the fact that in a lot of these places that have fiscal problems and economic problems, we also have residents where 15% or less have a college degree, and there's a total and complete mismatch between sort of the jobs that are becoming available and the skills that the folks who live in those places have. What do we do about the fact that there are cities like a Youngstown, Ohio, like a Kansas City, Kansas, where you've got this complete mismatch between where work is for people who live in the city and where home is for people who work in the city? I don't have those answers yet. But it is very much a focus of what we're trying to think through and what the National Resource Network process allows us to do, and what will be up to about 75 to 80 cities over the course of the next couple of years of the size, right? Because issues are different based on whether you're talking about a Youngstown versus a New Orleans versus a New York, of the size that I think a lot of the cities affected are.
And I would just echo, I think the question and the premise of it is exactly the challenge we've got. There are lots of people coming to New Orleans, lots more people coming to New Orleans with college degrees. The question for the soul of the city is, how do we help the folks who have lived there a long, long time, who've suffered through poverty, discrimination, inequitable opportunity, and enable them to be successful? And so the mayor always says we're going to have the people of New Orleans rebuild New Orleans. But a lot of our training programs, I think, are designed for folks who are coming out of different backgrounds. If you told my kids, go take a class at a community college, they could figure out how to navigate that, and they could figure out how to navigate placement into the job market. For Ms. May, or for somebody who's got too little high school to walk right into community college, that training program, we really have to figure out how to hold their hand, not in a paternalistic way, but just in a here's the connection we're going to help you make to that job. And so we're trying to be very intentional about finding individual people, matching them with training, and taking them the next step to the job, rebuilding our sewer and water system, rebuilding some of these hospitals, getting jobs in the areas we're creating. Because it can't just be that there's an influx of population, because New Orleans is a great place to live, and we're delighted by that. But we've got to, for the future of the city, make sure we invest in the people who have been there all along and who've been left behind before. We're not going to leave them behind this time.
Yeah, and I would just say that my research showed that a lot of these cities are balancing their budget, but part of that balancing act is cutting community development expenditures, which certainly puts the opportunity structure at risk. And creating opportunity requires money. I think cities might have to look elsewhere, whether it's to their nonprofit partners or philanthropy. But I think it requires a city vision to make all that happen. And like Andy just demonstrated, I think New Orleans has that vision. So I think if the city can provide the vision and find the resources, potentially through non-public means, that's my best answer.
Okay. Thank you. And I'm going to take one more minute of time and ask you to do two things. First of all, I've been reminded to remind you that there are evaluation forms in your binders and that those should be filled out at the end of the day. So your feedback is extremely valuable to all of us. And finally, the second thing, I hope that you will join me in thanking this panel and that it's been a useful